Salutations Rangers, General Bradley 101 back at you again with some more lore. And today's episode, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with our 3-part series about explaining every single unit of the Space Marines in every single era. And today's video we're covering the middle period, the longest period and everyone's most favorite period, that being the Long War. Basically from the end of the Heresy and the Scouring up until the return of Big Bobby G and the Lion. But without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, grab a snack, get ready, and let's get ready to dive into some awesome, amazing Space Marine lore. So, as always, if you guys didn't watch the first episode, highly recommend, very good. We're going to be covering over 5 different categories of Space Marines today. First up, we're going to be having the HQ section, quite simple, anyone that can be considered a commander or a leader in the Space Marine force. But then we're going to have the Infantry section, anyone who has boots on the ground. The Elite section, really elite boots on the ground. Specialists, anyone who has a unique type of role, chaplains, apothecaries, etc. Land support, anything that is used to support a Space Marine on the land that is not infantry based. Air support and space support with our final category. That is basically everything that flies above and even above in space. Think your Thunderhawks as well as strike cruisers. So with that sorted, let's get cracking on. As you can imagine, there was a lot of change after the Scouring. The Imperium itself was shattered, and most of the Primarchs were going to be going away in the next 1,000 years, and that left the Space Marines to their own devices. But they did have something, that being the Codex Astartes. Now some legions willingly embraced it, some legions absolutely did not, and some legions had to be convinced via gunpoint, or, siege point in this case. But ultimately, every single Space Marine legion would be divided into 1,000-man chapters. But we'll touch up more about that later. To start up with our HQ section, it's very similar to the Legion section, but slight differences. First up is that they're all standardized. The idea of a unique rank completely, almost nearly went away with the introduction of the chapters. Whilst they'd have the unique names for them, they basically filled out the same roles. As I mentioned before, we have sergeants, which are locked at a 10-man formation, but could be combat squatted into 5 men. And basically, if it's an infantry formation, these are the chaps who lead them. These are seasoned battle brothers who usually are veterans, but not always the case, and have showed expert skill in their craft. We then move on to captains. Captains lead a company. Each Space Marine chapter will have about 10 companies, and these are again veteran warriors that have proven themselves adept in one area or another. Now, depending on their temperament as well as their various different personalities, they could be assigned to one of the 10 companies, which are as follows. The first company, the elite company or the veteran company. These are the chapter's best of the best, their strongest elements, and what they're most known for. I.e., if they're a very fast-moving chapter, they're going to have very elite bikers. If they're a hard-hitting chapter, maybe elite devastators if they're very tanky, Terminator armor. But that is what the veteran first captain is. But generally speaking, the captain of the first company is the most veteran, the most senior, and not always the case, but if the chapter master falls, he is generally speaking assumed to be next in line. Again, not always, but happens a lot. We then have the 2nd to 5th companies. Those are battle line companies. Again, quite simple, these are companies that are meant to go in there, to fight, to take the fight, simple as. We then have the 6th and 9th companies. Those are the reserve companies. That being a reserve tactical company, a reserve devastator company, and a reserve assault company. The majorities of these units are based off tactical squads, devastator squads, and assault squads. The idea being that if any of the battle line companies should suffer any damage, these units would come in and replace them. Again, we'll talk more about that later. And then finally we have the 10th company, the scout company. This essentially holds about 100 scouts, as well as some scout sergeants, which are fully fledged battle brothers. Scouts are not fully fledged battle brothers yet, but they're close on their way. They also hold an undisclosed amount of neophytes. Again, it depends, could be a few hundred, could be a few thousand. Really does depend. Again, the limit of the Codex Astartes was 1,000 battle brothers per chapter. So, if it's not a battle brother, loophole. Looking at you, Black Templars. But all of these captains would be placed in a specific company for their own specific sets by the Chapter Master. The Chapter Master is the leading figure of a Space Marine chapter. He is the big kahuna, the head honcho, and generally speaking, throughout the entirety of the Long War, the Chapter Master was, generally speaking, everything. He was the highest ranking leader, but he was almost always the greatest combatant. He was essentially the guy. Whereas in the Heresy, we see that HQs were often differed based on their various different specialities, siege breakers, assault troops, massive signals, etc. This was not the case here. The Chapter Master, and generally speaking many captains, or all of, if not every one of these things. And that goes to show that how the Space Marine Legion changed into the chapter. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. But all in all, that wraps up the HQ section. Very similar to the Legion structure, but whereas the Legion structure, that was the base, here in the chapter, it is everything. Like, that is it. There is no other ones. These are the 3 HQ choices you can get. But with that out of the way, let's move into infantry. First up, we have the Tactical Squad. And the Tactical Squad is one of the squads that changed the least, if any, throughout the entirety of a Space Marine's lifespan. Tactical Squad are the line holders, the base infantry, stock standard. They're meant to hold the line, take the charge, and drive the enemy back, armed with bolters, grenades, as well as combat knives. These guys are the base, and they make up the most. Generally speaking, their role didn't change much, their equipment didn't really change much either. If anything, they doubled down on what they were supposed to do. But all in all, tactical squads are the bread and butter of a Space Marine, and the humble rifleman with his gun still continues to be an excellent opportunity. We then have the assault squads. Assault squads, again, didn't really change much. They were the hard-hitting shock assault troops, armed with chainswords, bolt pistols, grenades, as well as jump packs, bounding from building to building, leaping to leaping, and hitting really hard. We then have the Devastators. The Devastators are essentially an evolution of the Heavy Support Squad. They are armed specifically with heavy weapons, and they are the first infantry unit that we see that have changed dramatically, or, has much change, I should say. Devastators could come in either 5 or 10-man squads. But, interesting to note, the Sergeant enough himself would not be armed with a type of heavy weapon. Instead, he'd be armed with a bolter, and more specifically, some type of targeting equipment, that being the Signalite Cherub. The idea was that the 4 men were supposed to pour fire, whereas it was the Sergeant's job to direct that fire. Essentially, we have a Sergeant acting as both a spotter, scout, as well as commander, giving him complete tactical control over his squad, which again is a very interesting concept and quite a different doctrine compared to the Legion structure. The Devastators were armed with a variety of heavy weapons, be it heavy bolters, las cannons, multi-melters, plasma cannons, missile launchers, whatever you need basically. And then finally, to wrap up the infantry section, we then have the Scouts. The Scouts, again, didn't really change much over from the Legion days. They were pretty simple, pretty straightforward, not exactly battle brothers yet, clad in scout armor, and they were meant to go ahead and scout ahead, gather information, and then pull back. And that, ladies and gentlemen, wraps it up for the infantry section. As you can note, significantly shorter than the Legion section, and a hell of a lot more specialized. But from the standard monk crunchers, we move on to those who are just a cut above the rest. Let's talk about elites. So then in elites, we first start with the veterans. Veterans, again, haven't really changed much. They are still the elite. They have shown themselves over their time of service, and they have just proven to be better at one particular aspect, be it melee combat, blade combat, or anything in between. And they have the chapter's arsenal open to them. They can take a variety of weapons, be they storm shields, combat blades, power weapons, heavy weapons, whatever they want. Though, an important thing to note here, the veterans of the Legion are generally speaking considered to be inferior to the veterans of the chapter. Now, why do I say this? The whole Great Crusade Horus Heresy period only lasted about 200 years, whereas the actual Space Marine Long War lasted well over 10,000, but generally speaking the average veteran being a couple hundred years old compared to the Space Marine Legion, which is only about 100. So generally speaking, in the very worst case scenario, we can say that they're only double the amount of years older in terms of veterancy, which is still a lot. So all in all, generally speaking, the veterans of the chapter were more specialized. Not only were they more specialized, they were more veteran in that they just existed for longer, but also they had more combat experience. Granted, it was more of a low-intensity combat, but still, combat nonetheless. So, something to keep in mind. But whereas the company veterans are the standard veteran Marines that could do either or, there are 2 unique flavors that really knuckle down into what it meant to be a Space Marine. We have first off the Stern Guard, and my favorite. The Stern Guard are the elite of the elite when it comes to long-range warfare. These are generally speaking tactical Marines who have shown an absolute panache for being marksmen. Armed with master-crafted bolters and special issue ammunition, they are able to lay a devastating amount of fire to any type of unit. They are generally speaking meant to hang in the back, unload fire upon fire, and just wait for the enemy to come close and give them one hell of a good morning. But they're not only armed with ranged weapons. Generally speaking, they're often armed with chainswords as well, which makes them into sort of a hybrid unit. The idea being is that they're meant to destroy the enemy from range, but if the fella gets up close, well, they got a chainsaw to say hello. Not to mention, in my opinion, they look the best. The drip is immaculate. Not to mention, I adore their sort of hybrid role to them. Just really great. Love them. But if you're not a fan of flexibility and you just really love a big hammer, we then have the Vanguard Veterans. Now these are a lot of people's favorite purely because they are assault marines who have again proven themselves really good at what they do and have been granted the special issue arms and armor of the chapter. They, like their Stern Guard veteran counterpart, are clad in artificer armor, but they wield master crafted weapons. Generally speaking, power weapons, with either a storm shield being in one, and let's say a power fist, power maul, power axe in the other, or double lightning claws or big chunky thunder hammer. These are the hammer of the company. These are the wrath of the chapter. These are devastation incarnate. You send these boys not only to hit hard, but specifically. Generally speaking, Vanguard veterans are used in decapitating strikes. They target a very important leader, or let's say there's a piece of artillery that's really giving you hell. These are the boys that you send in. They're meant to go in and destroy whatever they touch. And they're not going to come out unless they themselves either succeed or die trying. It's very much a Space Marine. And I can understand why they're everyone's favorite. And then finally, for the elites, we then have Terminators. Again, with this, not really much difference in variation as with Legion. Generally speaking, every single one used standard Indomitus pattern, which generally speaking is a nice balance of protection, speed, and firepower. And again, they could be armed and armored as either an assault based, that being with a storm shield as well as thunderhammer or double lightning claws meant to get up close and personal with the enemy and cut them up in brutal melee combat, or they could be armed as a standard support, that being armed with storm bolters, power fists, and generally speaking heavy weapons, either being the Cyclone missile launcher or Reaper Gatling cannon. Now, it's important to note, generally speaking, Terminator armor became quite rare amongst chapters in general, and whilst some of the original Legion-based chapters did have access to the relic patterns, i.e. Tartaros as well as Cataphracti, they would generally speaking use less and less and less. But it's not out of common for, let's say, the Salamanders have like a Fire Drake squad lying around, throw them in, or the Ultramarines having a full Bantara squad ready to throw them out. They do have them, they still possess them, but it's one of the things that like they're very wary to use them because, as I said, they're relics. And that does it for our elite section. Again, very similar how we noticed into the infantry section, significantly downsized, but more specifically than that, whereas when we covered in the Legion section, the elites were hilariously spread out in terms of Legion to Legion. Here, though, in chapters, they're all the same. You can always find these same fellas here, but most importantly, having a special elite outside of these four wasn't really a thing. Space Marine chapters again knuckled down to what they knew and what the Codex Astarte said, hence when we got this. We then have the specialist section, starting us off with the chaplain. But generally speaking, whereas the chaplain was much more of a morale officer, discipline officer type thing, here in the modern Long War, it has evolved into a pure-on spiritual support. He is exactly as he says, he is a chaplain. He is meant to channel the spiritual purity of the Imperium against the hordes of demonic chaos. And for the very few chapters who actually do worship the Emperor as a god, i.e. the Black Templars, he's a full-on preacher. Chaplains are meant to offer spiritual support, but also literal support, as most of them end up being frontline fighters fighting with their brothers. We then have the Librarius. The Librarius, same thing, magic Space Marines. Again, twofold. They can either offer combat psychers, but their main reason why they're there is to keep lore records of the chapter. And ironically enough, this became incredibly more important with the chapter than in the Legion. As with each Legion having its own unique chapter, history, and documentary, there was much more emphasis placed in the Librarius. Also, the whole nonsense about the Edict of Nicaea went away, so the stigma about them went away as well. We then have the Tech Marine. Tech Marine, stock standard, a Space Marine adept that is trained by Mars to become a master of all types of artisan and craft. They're meant to service vehicles, repair arms and armor, but generally speaking they're not the sole person doing it, they're more like the overseer for their servitors or other Space Marines depending on the chapter. And then finally we have the Apothecary. The Apothecary's main job is to be a Space Marine medic, to heal and more importantly to recover the gene seed. Now in the Legion this indeed was a thing, but in the chapter it became much more important. Because generally speaking, the number of apothecaries went down significantly compared to those in the Legion. So each apothecary's job was much more important. Combined with the fact that Space Marine logistics, generally speaking, was self-sufficient, meaning that the only person you could rely on was your boys back home, recovering gene seed became incredibly important. Significantly much more so than in the Heresy. And that does it for our elite section. Again, very slimmed down. And again, much like the elites, these were all of them. There were no unique chapter variants. Now granted, you may have one or two in some of the older chapters, but generally speaking, this was it. They were the exception, not the rule. But from the specialists who make the chapter run, to all the heavy bits and bobs that make it hit hard, let's talk about land support. Right, first up we have the Scout Bikers. These are Scout Marines that are armed with light bikes. Generally speaking, they're used as either scouting or in some cases reconnaissance. But again, depends on the chapter. Armed with bolters as well as a variety of weapons, be they shotguns, sniper rifles, or chainswords in some case. Depending on the chapter, these guys are meant to operate as such. But generally speaking, they're lightly armed and they move pretty fast. We then have the Land Speeder. The Land Speeder is a light support craft. Generally speaking, crewed by 2 Space Marines, armed with bolters, and generally speaking, a heavy weapon. Now this could be either a heavy bolter, or more commonly, a multi-melter. Now generally speaking, when you want reconnaissance, i.e. scouting and force, you want to send these boys. Zoom in at Mach 10, one of the fastest land vehicles that the Space Marines possess. They're able to get good information, and in some cases they will be used as tank hunter roles. As I said, moving quickly, moving fast, and with that big old multi-melter, it can do the job quite well. We then have Bikers. Stock standard Space Marine bikers, the biker has a twin bolter setup and these boys were armed with chainsaws, bolt pistols and crack grenades. Again, either used as a type of heavy reconnaissance or Space Marine cavalry, meant to hit hard, hit home and absolutely annihilate the enemy. Absolutely devastating to infantry formations, especially mortal infantry formations. But sometimes, if you want to fight something other than infantry, you'll need an attack bike. The attack bike is essentially a regular bike, but it has a sidecar, and that sidecar, generally speaking, has a heavy weapon. Again, could be plasma cannon, heavy bolter, or in most cases, the multi-melter. These were support units that were attached to the main biker unit. The idea being that the bikers would handle anything crunchy, and the attack bike would handle anything with a bit more of a thicker hide. And generally speaking, when employed by really fast-moving units such as the White Scars and the Raven Guard, they could be used to devastating effect. But from something that moves incredibly fast to something that moves incredibly slow, we then have the Dreadnought. Now, generally speaking, every single variant of the Dreadnought was indeed able to be accessed by the Space Marines, but the most common was the Casterferrum, as well as its upgraded version, the Venerable Dreadnought, which is just an upgraded Casterferrum. Again, they could be armed with one ranged weapon, one melee weapon, which is a standard loadout, or they could go double melee or double ranged. Again, relic dreadnoughts were a thing, contemptors and leviathans were a thing, but again used much more sparingly, because again, they're relics. Also, a lot of these boys were directly connected to the heresy, meaning that not only if you lose the dreadnought do you lose a massive piece of kit, you also lose a connection to your Primarch, which as we can see with the wolves is very prided on. But if you want a walk-in stompy murdery robot but you don't want to reuse your very expensive dreadnoughts, I present you the Centurion. The Centurion is a very divisive unit. Some people love it, some people hate it. I personally love it. But the Centurion Assault Walker is a suit of armor that is meant to be close around Space Marine power armor and is used to support the main assault. I.e., it's supposed to do what a Dreadnought does, but it's cheaper, it's less expensive, and you're not exactly going to worry if it goes up that much. And these are armed in two varieties, the Assault and the Support. Assault, pretty simple, armed with massive siege clouds or siege drills. They're meant to walk up to a wall or a tank and absolutely annihilate it in close quarters fire, with melters as well as bolters armed as the secondaries. We then have the Support. The Support are armed with heavy bolters as well as las cannons. Again, big chunky fire platform meant to park itself in a nice spot and rain down hellish amounts of fire. Any and all small arms against it are going to be like rain on a tin roof. You're going to need something pretty chunky in the anti-armor department if you want to get these boys to back off. Now, whether or not you like the look of it, you gotta admit, its actual purpose in Doctrine very well fits. Again, it's like a Dreadnought, but less expensive and more attritionable. So all in all, it's a pretty good idea to me. Now we then have the Rhino and its various different variants. The Rhino did not change much at all. It was a stock standard APC armed with a Stormbolter, and it could transfer about a squad worth, generally speaking, 10 Space Marines. And then of course we have the Predator. Now the Predator is interesting in that it is the only mainline assault battle tank. The Predator was the only one to survive the purge of the heresy that occurred, and it became the mainstay of Space Marine military formations. Armored spearheads were led primarily by the Predator, and they continue to be armed in the same fashion, with heavy bolters, las cannons, as well as the Predator autocannon, and the Hunter-Killer missile if you want to be spicy. Though it is important to say, a lot of the older legions still possess relic weapons and vehicles, but like all the other relic stuff, rarely used. We then have the Vindicator. The Vindicator didn't really change much up from the Heresy, and at the end of the day you need the big chunky assault tank to love all the big chunk and hecker honkers of HE. Vindicator is your guy. Besides, it just looks great. It was one of the few siege vehicles that actually remained from the Heresy, as generally speaking chapters became much more mobile than the legions. But even the chapters recognized that sometimes you needed to assault fortifications, and an assault tank like the Vindicator proved incredibly well. Not to mention, that big old sap shield, pretty good for hiding infantry behind. We then have the Razorback. The Razorback is a Rhino transport, but instead of an APC, it's an IFV, i.e. it has a big chunky heavy weapon on top of it. We then have the Whirlwind and its two variants, the Hunter and the Stalker. The Whirlwind is exactly the same as it was in the Heresy. Armed with the Whirlwind multi-missile launcher system, this thing was meant to rain down fire in various amounts, be it say Inferno munitions for infantry, anti-armor crack munitions for heavy armor, or anti-air, but generally speaking, it had two different variants for anti-air. First up we have the Hunter. This is for heavy-duty anti-air. Think big chunky things like Thunderhawks, Mantis, etc. It was armed with the Hunter missile launcher. This was a big heckin' chunkish missile that was going to slam into any type of aircraft and absolutely annihilate it. But if you're dealing something with a little bit more swarmy, say Tyranid flyers, we then have the Stalker. The Stalker was armed with a pair of twin Stalker flak cannons, and it was meant primarily for lighter infantry units, i.e. light aircraft and, as I said, Tyranid flyers. Not to mention, All three of these variants would have the advanced whirlwind targeting system, meaning not only could they hit hard, they could hit really accurately as well. We then have one of my favorite units, the Thunderfire Cannon. The Thunderfire Cannon is a giant artillery piece that is manned by a Space Marine Tech Marine, and it is direct fire support. It is meant to simply find a position, plop itself nice and neatly there, and just absolutely devastate enemy infantry or armor, or all of the above, because this fella has a unique weapon known as tremor shells. These shells were not designed to cause any type of damage of itself, but they were meant specifically to cause tremors. They would hit the earth and they would have a seismic impact to them, quite literally disrupting the ground beneath enemy units, meaning that infantry and tanks suddenly are not walking on solid ground, but broken earth. Not to mention, it's a big rotating Gatling cannon, and goddammit, does it just look cool. And then finally, to round everything out, we have one of the very few units that actually survive the big old purge from the heresy, that being the Land Raider. The beloved Land Raider, everyone's favorite big chunky tank. It is a big heckin' chunk of a tank that can transfer about 12 Space Marines, or again like 6 Terminators. Armed with a variety of different weapons, be it heavy flamers, las cannons, assault cannons, or just a massive fuck ton of bolters. These units are a mainstay of the Space Marine army for a reason, and they're absolutely badass, because god almighty do I not love my British World War I tanks. So that's going to wrap it up with our land support section. Again, significantly shorter than what we had previously in the Legion section. But from all the heavy things that are on the earth, let's move on to all the heavy stuff that is in the sky. Let's talk about the air/space support. And we're going to start off with, as always, the Thunderhawk. The Thunderhawk did not change much at all from the heresy, except that it went from being the smallest flyer to the biggest. It became the main transport unit, and was a mainstay of Space Marine aircraft period. All in all, not really much changes. Now again, granted, I haven't really have much to say because a lot of these things that existed didn't really change much, if anything, from the heresy. But we do have 2 new units to talk about. The first being the Storm Raven. The Storm Raven gunship is essentially a smaller version of the Thunderhawk. Again, used primarily by the Blood Angels and Raven Guard, it's meant to gain small units tactically in. It's much more zippy and agile than the standard Thunderhawk, but it's still pretty heavily armed, with a variety of heavy bolters and las cannons and missiles to take care of both ground and air targets. Again, it's a smaller, more nimble version, but still packs a good bit of punch, i.e. special operations type shit. And then finally, we have the Storm Talon. The Storm Talon is a one-man gunship. Imagine it like a smaller version of the Fire Raptor, armed again with heavy bolters as well as las cannons and missiles. This is a one-man assault craft. Imagine it like the one-man helicopter gunships from our own period, i.e. the Apache and the Cobra. It is meant to dart in and out of combat, and it's meant to devastate infantry targets. You don't exactly want it fighting aircraft. It can take a hit or 2 here and there, but generally speaking, you want this thing to find a nice infantry bob and absolutely annihilate it with its heavy munitions. Now, in terms of actual air-to-air aircraft, generally speaking, from chapter to chapter, this did indeed change. But one thing that was very common was the Stormhawk Interceptor. Now, this is essentially a Storm Talon, but anti-air rather than anti-ground. This is an air superiority fighter, and it could be armed with a variety of different weapons. But it always had a massive storm cannon on it, as well as heavy bolters, assault cannons, or it could swap out for las cannons as well, not to mention it had devastating Skyhammer and Typhoon missiles. These were heavy-duty anti-armor aircraft weapons, one for heavy-duty aircraft, one for lighter, more swarmy aircraft. Generally speaking, a Storm Talon and a Storm Raven would be joined together, one would hit the ground, the other would protect it from the air. And all in all, it made very good combination. But sadly, that's all that we have for the generic units available to all chapters. But again, some of the older chapters, like the Dark Angels, as well as the Raven Guard and the Storm and the Space Wolves, had their own unique type of flyers. But generally speaking, for all Space Marines, these are the 4 that you got, which is significantly less than the massive armadas that we had way back when, during the Legion days. And the same trend continues for their spacecraft. Generally speaking, Space Marines had the same 3 main categories, that being escort, transport, as well as capital. But whereas it varied from unit to unit and legion to legion, here, all of them had one of 3. For the escorts, it was composed of a formation of frigates and destroyers, the 3 most popular being the Gladius frigate, or the Nova frigate, and the Hunter Destroyer. For the cruisers, there was generally speaking 1 cruiser, that being the Strike Cruiser. But this wasn't really geared to ship-to-ship combat, it was much more geared towards planetary assault, but more specifically carrier. It had a large amount of carrying capacity for fighter base, as well as drop pod assaults. And it also possessed a bombardment system. Generally speaking, for cruisers, light cruisers like this especially, you didn't really see bombardment, that was more for the heavy ships. But in the aftermath of the Legion heresy, you then got these chapter formations combining the 2. And then finally, there's only one capital ship available to every single Space Marines, that being the battle barge. These are very, very heavily armed and armored capital ships, and they indeed pack one hell of a punch, but again, they're more designated towards drop assault. And looking at it as a whole, the Space Marine Navy changed dramatically from the Legion days. Whereas generally speaking it was a mixture of all types of craft, even the heavy hitting units like the battle barge are designed for ground combat in mind. They are meant to bombard the planet. They are meant to defend transport vessels. And it's one of those things when you look at it, you realize just exactly what the Space Marines changed to. Space Marines used to be a proper army, but with the changing of the legions into the chapters, they went from being an elite army to simply being special forces. In the aftermath of the heresy, it changed from being a massive conventional grand-scale combat to a low-intensity raiding combat. Generally speaking, with the exception of the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, maybe, and the Thousand Sons, all traitor legions were split into various different warbands. Even within those three, when their primarchs were not active, they split off into their own warbands. So you have various different smaller units raiding different areas. You have them assaulting, you have them fighting, you have them going everywhere doing everything. If you have a massive host of 100,000 Space Marines, they can only be in one place at one time. And even to divvy them up into 1,000 mans, it's going to take time, effort, and energy. So, what do? You have smaller 1,000 man units that are meant to act as a defensive force. If a Chaos Warband comes to raid a system, you send out the Space Marines to take care of them. And their fleet represents that. They're not designed for grand-scale ship bombardment, capital fighting anymore. All that went away. All of their units are designed to support a ground assault, aircraft, orbital bombardment, heavy units, and if the traitors should bring heavy ships, you have the battle barge, which is meant to defend until the Space Marines on the ground can get the job done. And that is something that applies to the entirety of the chapter. Throughout the entirety of covering this, we see two very important things. Numbers are heavily reduced, specializations are almost nearly gone. A perfect example of this are the elites. The Stern Guard are indeed long-range combat units. They are meant to hit hard with their bolters, but they're also armed with chainswords in case they need to get up close and personal. And when you look into it, you understand why that's the case. Space Marines changed. You only had 1,000 Marines, meaning that you couldn't ask for an extra 100 company of Assault Marines. Every single Space Marine had to do everything, meaning that if push came to shove, the standard tactical squad had to pick up a chainsword and do work. That Storm Talon is going to have to perform the duties of a Storm Raven, and we see that every single Space Marine was expected to do so much more, because again, the war changed, so the Space Marines changed with them. They became a massive sledgehammer of every single unit having every single thing, to being a small elite group where every single man could do every single thing that was asked of him. That was what mattered. Space Marines went from having individual specialists to every single Space Marine being a massive specialist in of himself. And all in all, it was a great change for what happened. Again, when you have something like the Long War, which is a long, drawn-out, low-intensity, relatively speaking, for 40k, conflict, you need a unit that is mobile and able to do everything. And that is what we see from the change from the Legion into a chapter. All of the things that were very important basically went away, because while they were important, they weren't important to the Long War. A prime example being super heavy tanks. As we can see, Space Marines had a wide variety of super heavy tanks, but when it came to the chapters, except from the original 20, they're all gone. Why? Because think about it, if a Chaos Warband is raiding, they're not exactly going to invade the planet. They're not going to try and take it over, at least not in a conventional sense. So with a Space Marine, it makes more sense to fill that hangar bay up with smaller predators than you would something big and chunky like a Fellblade. And we see that this is the main issue with the Space Marine chapter. Whilst, yes, it did really well in low intensity conflicts, we see that if you ever move into like higher intensity conventional warfare, the Space Marines suffer because they don't have the means to it. What you needed was a main central force that had all of these big chunky heavy units that could then send forth to reinforce the smaller units. And that's probably what was supposed to happen, with the Primarchs holding that main big force while these smaller chapters were meant to go around and do what they were supposed to do. But with the absence of the Primarchs, that whole plan kind of went up in smoke. But that's just me here thinking. Overall though, we see that the transformation of the Legion into the chapter makes a great deal of sense. The war changed. It went from being a war to a type of insurgency, I guess you could say, or a very low-intensity conflict. So the Space Marines went from being the true hammer of the Imperium into the surgical scalpel meant to pick apart and destroy the enemy that no other men could. Space Marine Chaos Warbands became smaller. So Space Marine warbands in of themselves also became smaller to counteract them. But again, when the Space Marines needed to be a conventional unit, they did indeed suffer, because they had no centralized command, they had no centralized anything. But as we'll cover in our last episode, that changed quite a bit. But you guys are gonna have to wait until next week before we get into that episode. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you guys also very much for watching. I hope you guys really enjoyed this. Let me know down below, what do you guys think? Do you guys prefer the Long War era? So far, which is your favorite? And let me know what you guys are thinking. But I want to say a massive thank you to you guys for watching, but an even more massive thank you to my awesome members and Patreons. And massive shout out to my Officer Corps, my Lieutenant Tiers. Shout out Mr. Eddie V3 and Miss Major of the Void. Big shout out to all my Sergeant Tier fellas. Mr. Damiak, Mr. Andy McGee, Mr. Warsmith the Fireheart, Mr. Cords Butcher, and Mr. Sean IRL7. Shout out to my corporate tier members, Mr. Bowen and Tremail the Mouth Kitty. And finally, but certainly not least, big shout out to my private tier members, Mr. Thomas Moslons, Mr. Ivan_SBW, Mr. Michael Hayeda, Mr. Hattori's Kurs, and of course, Mr. Monkey Man. And very big shout out to my Patreon members, Mr. Fortus Unum, General Alexander, and Mr. Bulwin. Thank you, each and every one of you. It means the absolute world to me. You guys are amazing, and I appreciate each and every one of you. So join up with the members, you get a bunch of awesome benefits, and you get to help out your boy. But remember, whether you give me a dollar or not, I will love you just the same. Mwah! But ladies and gentlemen, I've been the General Bradley 101. You'll be beautiful, awesome, and amazing people. Make sure to stay low out there, boys and girls. And I will catch y'all next time. This was Rangers. There really wasn't a lot to talk about this episode because like all the units basically stayed the same.